those of you at least hoping that, well, Boris Johnson will go away forever and never return to politics, unfortunately, as I've said before, I don't think that's likely. I think Boris will probably take a rest for the time being, but eventually he will return in one shape or form. But for those of you who have been at least maybe keeping up with the post-political adventures of one Liz Truss, you know full well that, well, Liz Truss will one day probably make an attempt at trying to retake leadership of the Conservative Party. And if she ever does, we can only hope that she never actually becomes Prime Minister. Because if she does, not only does she continue to double down on her ridiculous free market fundamentalist rhetoric, but she still continues to insist that her actions were completely right and correct and that she did nothing wrong. Yes, and once again, it is always worth remembering that Liz Truss, the ex-Prime Minister, the shortest serving Prime Minister ever in history, not to die, because that's a careful caveat that you've got to add, it is always worth remembering that she pretty much crashed the UK economy and almost destroyed the UK pensions industry and was hours away from doing so had the Bank of England not stepped in. It's always worth to remind you of Liz Truss's absolutely catastrophic legacy that she still refuses to apologize for. After all, we are still suffering from her catastrophic effects of the economic shock that was the mini budget. And say what you will about Kersey Kutang, obviously joining up at that time with Liz Truss, but even he is desperately trying to save whatever he potentially can of his political career by making sure that he and Liz Truss are as far apart as possible. But before we get more into Liz Truss's recent outings, please do remember to click on that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a rotation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And of course, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do watch. And again, click the like and share button. Like I say, down below, there's the Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee. There's the YouTube thank you button. And of course, there's the Pony Club down below as well. So thank you always very much to those people who do help support the channel. Even if you do, just click the like and share button. It all helps out grow the channel. So, oh my word, the last time I remember we covered Liz Truss was her Margaret Thatcher Freedom Lecture in front of the Heritage Foundation, where she once again doubled down on her economic mantra that what she did was right and correct, and that in reality it wasn't her fault. Her ideas were in the right. It was just people just weren't ready. People just weren't ready for this kind of grand economic thinking. And lo and behold, Liz Truss has recently been out, surprisingly, after Joe Biden. Because you may remember, I think it was just last year, Biden passed the massive Inflation Reduction Act. And one of those things in the Inflation Reduction Act, it gave a load of subsidies to new green companies to literally this year. There are spades in the ground building battery factories, electric car factories, green, industrial manufactories of the future. Those are being built now, and there are subsidies galore for companies that want to invest there or bring their businesses here. And of course, it has introduced an element of protectionism. And of course, Liz Truss, being the free market fundamentalist she is, completely hates the idea of any sort of protectionism. Of course, bear in mind, Liz Truss at one point was a Remainer and seemed to enjoy the protection that the single market and customs union gave the UK at the same time. Like I say, Liz Truss will just take up seemingly any political position she thinks if it will advance her career. And this is why I think eventually she will probably at least try and return to the limelight. So this is what she had to say about Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. So she said, this agenda is not exactly fashionable at the moment. In fact, we might say that the overturn window has shifted to the left across the world. If we look at what's happening in corporate boardrooms and where there's a lot more chat about identity politics than there are about making a profit, and if we look at what Joe Biden is doing in America with state subsidies and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which it is actually reducing inflation, but there you go. How is that going, Joe? If we look at that, rather than making America more competitive, or and again, I like that. Look at that rather than making America more competitive. And again, it's worth reminding you, because Liz Truss is now a free market fundamentalist, what she means by that is lowering tariffs all to zero and going full on, fully exclusively, well, essentially for no regulations whatsoever. That's what they mean by more competitive. But she continues saying, or of course, the ODEC, the Organization for Economic and Cooperation Development, which is currently trying to impose minimum tax rates on the free world. And yes, this is because, as we have said, there has been a severe pushback to all this neo-economic liberalism, which basically said, hey, look, we should be massively engaged with free trade across and around the world. Now, there's no problem with free trade, but there always comes a problem. What happens to your own economy? What effects does that have on your own economy? And we are seeing now the complete backlash against this massive neoliberal economic agenda that there was. It's free markets everywhere, because what happened? We've seen jobs and industries basically pick up and leave to go to other countries because they can get away with having basically, cheap as chips slave labor, where they can basically pay them, a pittance a day, compared to where they might have to pay someone in the UK an actual decent living wage. This is one of the big things that we have seen. And now you have things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which are attracting all sorts of companies around the world to do it. Take a prime example, because the EU's had something very similar. Intel. Intel was going to come to the UK, but because of the EU's own version it has of the Inflation Reduction Act, it has now decided, yeah, forget the UK completely. No more investments in the UK. We're going to Europe. And that's Intel, one of the biggest manufacturers of microchips and sort of computer technologies in the world, saying the UK is not worth investing in. And yet, Liz Truss not only wants to double down on that economic nonsense, which has made, which we are seeing a complete reaction to, and that's why we're seeing sort of more protectionism sort of come back in, because hey, we've got to sort of at least protect some of our economies. We can't just say, hey, it's an open free for all, because we've seen what the consequences of that for their economy. It takes away jobs from the economy, which actually events in bad outcomes for people living in the country. So we can only hope that, once again, that, well, Liz Truss never ever really does make it to be prime minister again, because we saw her short tenure, and if she ever did make it in again, then oh boy, that would be bad. But if Liz Truss does become leader of the Conservative Party again, then you will probably see the Conservatives for a long while pursue this mad economic free market fundamentalism, which of course ended up crashing the economy and of course destroying the pensions industry here in the UK. Again, always worth reminding why Liz Truss was such a bad prime minister and why she got booted out as quickly as she did. And I've always will maintain, if the Queen had not died, and given her those sort of 2 weeks during that funeral, well, she would have lasted even shorter. She would have lasted even shorter than that. So As always, like I say, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, as always, thank you very much for watching. And we'll, of course, we'll see you all next time.